Hello, and welcome back to the Transformations of the Global System. I am Dr. Nicole Warmington Granston. Today, we'll be looking at environmental issues. So, what we'll explore today is environmental politics, climate change, international environmental cooperation, globalization's environmental impact, and global governance of environmental issues. With that, we'll argue that that environmental problems are increasingly global and require international cooperation because environmental damage crosses national borders. Now, what are environmental issues in global politics? Environmental politics studies how states and international actors respond to environmental challenges. Some key issues are climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, global commons, and sustainable development. So we're going to be looking at how environmental issues are now central to international relations and global governance. Some early concerns when we look at international and environmental issues was that before globalization, there were two major environmental concerns. These included the conservation of natural resources and pollution damage. We find that environmental problems often cross borders and requires cooperation between states. Now, there's what was known as the Trail Smelter case. This case was very important because it established the principle that states are responsible for environmental damage caused by other countries. We find that this is a very early example of international economic accountability. Then, over time, we saw the development of global environmental governance. In 1972, we had the 1972 Stockholm Conference, and the major achievement of this conference was the creation of the United Nations Environmental Programme. The key contribution has been that it introduced international cooperation on environmental protection. Then we had the development of the concept known as sustainable development. This came from the Brundtland Commission and the report that introduced this concept. And sustainable development is basically development that meets present needs without harming future generation. So we find that environmental protection and economic development are said to be connected. Then in 1992, we had the Earth Summit, also known as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So the main outcomes were Agenda 21 and greater connection between environment and development. This was an important shift because environmental issues became linked with poverty, clean water, sanitation, and agriculture. We also saw the rise of environmental NGOs. We saw where environmental disasters and public concern led to the growth of environmental NGOs. Examples of these were Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The role of these NGOs are to raise awareness, pressure governments, and promote environmental protection. So we're seeing now that NGOs have become major non-state actors in environmental politics. Now let's look at the environment and some international relations theory. Now, according to the liberal institutionalist school, we find that environmental problems require cooperation, international institutions and global governance. The key idea is that states can achieve collective gains through cooperation. Under this concept, we saw the development of epistemic communities. Now, these are networks of scientists, experts, and policymakers who shape environmental policy through scientific knowledge. So we're seeing where scientific expertise increasingly influence international environmental policy. Then we have the Marxist perspective. And the main argument has been that neoliberal capitalism has contributed heavily to environmental destruction. So the critiques they have are against consumerism, industrial expansion, exploitation of the global south, and relocation of pollution-intensive production to the global south. So you see again, while we're getting more of this optimistic point of view from the liberal school, they talk about cooperation, we're seeing where the Marxist critiques are picking up on the downfalls of capitalism. Then there's a third perspective that looks at the link between war and environmental damage. The main idea from the school says that war can severely damage ecosystems. Examples of this have been forest destruction during World War I and Agent Orange that was used during Vietnam. So we're finding that security and environmental issues are interconnected. Now let's look at some of the functions of international environmental cooperation. You find that environmental governance exists because pollution affects multiple countries. The main function of this cooperation is that of pollution control, resource management, scientific cooperation, trade regulation, and conservation agreements. Some of the conservation agreements that have developed from this have been the long range transbordery air pollution agreement in 1979 that addressed atmospheric pollution in Europe and North America. We see in the signing of hazardous waste agreements that regulated the movement of dangerous waste internationally. And there's a Cartagena protocol that addressed biosafety and genetically modified organisms. Then there's also been the development of what we call the precautionary principle, which basically is environmental harm should be prevented even without complete scientific certainty. The key idea is that governments should act before environmental damage becomes irreversible, and we see that prevention under this protocol is central to environmental governance. Then we are seeing the development of norm creation and capacity building. The main goal is that environmental agreements increasingly focus on transferring technology, funding, expertise, and institutional support. We find that an important point has been that developing countries often need assistance in adapting to environmental challenges. Now let's look at scientific understanding and the development of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, the IPCC was created by the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Organization. Its main role is to provide scientific assessments on climate change. The function of the IPCC has been to gather scientific data, evaluate climate research, create future climate scenarios, and inform policymakers. You find that science is important to global environmental governance. So let's talk about this idea of the global commons. So when we talk about governing the global commons is basically shared natural resources outside of national ownership, such as the atmosphere, oceans, Antarctica, and outer space. Then we talk about the tragedy of the commons. The main idea is that shared resources may be overused because individuals pursue self-interest. The key problem is that no single actor wants to bear the cost of conservation. And we find that there is this connection between this concept and climate change and pollution. Let's talk now about some environmental regimes. The main idea is that we find that the global commons require international cooperation. The major problem, though, in developing these environmental regimes is that there is the issue of free riding, where states will benefit from environmental protection without contributing equally. Some examples of environmental regimes are MARPOL from 1973 that focused on pollution from ships. There's the Montreal Protocol that was widely viewed as a successful environmental agreement. Some of the success factors included scientific consensus, international cooperation, and clear targets. Then we can talk more about climate change itself, where we know that climate change, the main cause, is said to be greenhouse gases from fossil fuels. Some of the key concerns have been rising temperatures, extreme weather, sea level rise, human displacement, and economic disruption. So we find that climate change is linked directly to modern economic growth. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 that its main purpose was to help to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions globally. Its main features include emission reduction commitments, emission trading, joint implementation, and a clean development mechanism. Of course, some common but differentiated responsibilities is something else that has come up, where the key principle has been that developed countries should bear greater responsibility because they historically produce more emissions, and developing countries are more vulnerable. Of course, we talked about this, that there's this major free rider problem. Now, when we define this free rider problem, we find that some states benefit from environmental protection without contributing equally. An example of this is that the United States have never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, but has benefited from some of the efforts that have been made by Europe in how they've reduced their own greenhouse gases. So we find that in this case, because of this free rider problem, you find that cooperation sometimes is difficult in global environmental politics. But there's also this link between globalization and environmental degradation. We see that globalization increases awareness of environmental problems, but it also contributes to environmental degradation. Some examples have been industrialization, fossil fuel usage, consumerism, and global transportation. So the main takeaways I would like for you to have on the discussion about environmental issues in global politics is that environmental problems are global and require international cooperation, that climate change is one of the most important challenges in global politics, and that globalization contributes both to environmental awareness and environmental degradation. Some key terms I'd like for you to remember are sustainable development, global commons, climate change, greenhouse gases, precautionary principle, free rider problem, environmental regimes, Kyoto Protocol, IPCC, tragedy of the commons, and capacity building. With that, I'd end with this. Environmental issues demonstrate that in an interconnected world, no country can solve global ecological challenges alone. Thank you.